Number 10. Not so friendly. This story goes, my family and I used to live in a rough neighborhood when I was a kid. One night it was just my mom, my 2 siblings, and I at home, and my dad was gone on a business trip. Around midnight, someone started knocking on our door. My mom woke up, went to the front door, and asked who it was. No one answered, and this happened multiple times, so she began to worry and grabbed a weapon to protect herself. Then more knocking. My mom begins shouting at whoever it is that she's going to call the cops. At about 2 a.m. the police finally showed up and did a quick search outside of our house while we waited inside. After their search, they told my mom that they had found a piece of barbed wire about 4 feet long next to the front door and asked if it belonged to my mom. It didn't, and the cops told her it belonged to whoever was knocking on the door. That they were planning on strangling my mom with the barbed wire when she opened the door to see who was knocking. That morning, as they were searching around the house, they found footprints leading around to the back of the house and up to my bedroom window. They had also found nicks in the window seal where the person was trying to pry it open to break in, but failed. My mom always suspected it was this one neighbor because he would always stare at my mom through his curtains and wasn't very friendly. He also knew when my dad wasn't home. We moved out of that house after that, and all I can say is that was a good choice because that sounds terrifying. Number 9. Wouldn't take no. This user said my neighbor had seen me stumbling to my front door drunk and decided he'd try playing into my obviously altered state. I was young, so I was still unsure how to handle those types of males, and my birthday had just passed, so when he gave me a hug, I assumed it was a nice gesture. Then I tried hurrying off, but he kept trying to come in and have a beer to celebrate more appropriately. He refused to take no for an answer, so I pretended like I didn't have my house keys to hold him off. I walked a little bit off to the side, pretending to call someone who might have my keys, but I really called my cousin, telling him how freaked out I was. He rushed over to get me right away. The neighbor dude was in his 50s and I was 22. He didn't take kindly to my rejection that night and ended up poisoning my dogs later on out of pure pettiness. That sounds so creepy, and why'd you have to take it out on the dog? Number 8. Not a family man. This online user said, I didn't really talk to him, but I'm pretty sure he did something to his wife and daughter. When I met the wife, she was really sweet, but the husband, however, was kinda sketchy. Then one day, the police came knocking. They asked my mom if she knew anything about the neighbors, said that he and the wife supposedly gotten divorced, and asked if we knew the whereabouts of his wife and daughter. We said no, and they told us that apparently the wife ran away and they couldn't track down the daughter. The only thing we knew about the wife was that she had a daughter, was maybe pregnant, and she drove a white Jeep. A couple months later, the husband was cleaning his car and my mom and I were leaving for an appointment when my mom noticed the white Jeep in the garage. If the wife had run off, then wouldn't she have taken the Jeep? The dude saw that my mom had noticed the white Jeep, and a couple days later, he sold it. At one point, we had gotten a package for them delivered to our house, so we went to return it. His house smelled like illegal substances and the deceased, and we saw a weapon on the dining room table. Again, terrifying. Number 7. Stalked. This user had very strange encounters with one of their neighbors. They said, there is this one guy in my neighborhood. We seem to operate on the same schedule since we see each other at the bus stop almost every day. We never talk much, he always just asks me for a cigarette, and I usually give him one. The problem is I don't have a sensible schedule. My classes are at a different time every day and get rescheduled more often than not, and I make my own work hours, so I just come in whenever. Last time I saw him was a couple of hours ago. I'm walking home middle of the night and some guy jumps me from the back saying, do you have a cigarette? I turn around and it's the same guy, just strolling around the neighborhood at 2:30 a.m. looking for someone to lend him a smoke. Now that seriously sounds like a stalker, and I hope this person has protected themselves. Number 6. Faking it. This person tells a story about their mother. They said, my mom had this neighbor who pretended to be weak from cancer/chemo, so her landlord couldn't get mad at her for when the trash bins were full and the lawn was filthy. She even went as far as shaving her head and faking a limp, cane, and everything. Mom baked her some cookies and offered to take care of her bins and lawn, and another neighbor spilled about her scam. My mom, now enlightened about my neighbor's faking and tired of the trash blowing into our yard, called the landlord. Neighbor wasn't happy and would blast music at ungodly hours of the night morning to get back at my mom. Mom would get frustrated because she worked late and left early, filed a noise complaint with the police. The neighbor claims my mom, an old little Asian lady, punched her in the chest. The neighbor wants her arrested, mom shows cops our security cam footage, no mom punching, instead finds crazy neighbor kicking her daughter out in the middle of the night. The daughter is banging on her door and my mom comes out to check on the noise, tries to bring the hysterical girl inside, and the neighbor comes out and sprays her with a hose. Then the neighbor was taken away and the daughter was sent to live with dad. That honestly sounds like a happy ending for everyone involved. Number 5. Stealing farm animals. This user said, I live on a farm and we had one guy who was a real jerk. He was known to have definitely stolen sheep from us. In some cases, he had shorn the wool off of them, sold it, and returned the sheep, and sometimes ate the sheep as we suspect. He demanded that we front the bill to fix the fence despite it being between our two properties and refusing to split the costs. He had a house on the property that he rented to his farmhand, and the farmhand found him in there one day, going through his things and telling him he wasn't allowed to leave the property under any circumstances while under his employ. The guy quit straight after that and wanted to work for us. We had another old neighbor who regularly would try and play chicken with us in the car and once pointed a weapon at my dad after my dad questioned why he sent his friends to hunt on our property. One horrible neighbor is one thing, but having to deal with two, I can't imagine. Number 4. Terrorizing a neighborhood. This online user said, when I was in high school, there were a few disturbing occurrences in my neighborhood. A woman down the street who lived alone woke up one night to go to the bathroom and heard her TV on in the living room. She found a guy sitting on her couch watching the TV. She started screaming, obviously terrified, and the guy ran out of her house. Maybe a week later, there was a family with a young daughter. She woke up in the middle of the night with her bedsheets pulled down and a guy tickling her feet. Again, started screaming and the guy fled. Another week or so later, 3 houses down where an elderly couple lived, the husband woke up in the middle of the night to find a man standing over his bed and staring at his wife sleeping. Now they somehow figured out who it was and everyone in the neighborhood got a flyer with his picture. Behind us was a densely wooded area that stretches for a couple of miles in every direction. This guy had been literally living in those woods for upwards of a month in a tent. One night in the middle of all these incidents, we had our sliding glass door open with just the screen door behind it shut. We had a big backyard and it was pitch black back there at night. Our dog suddenly jolted up and started growling viciously. My father jumped up and put the floodlight on over the deck to see what was back there, but there was nothing. The next morning we were outside doing yard work and noticed the lock on our back gate was broken. It's very safe to assume that this guy had tried to get into our backyard house but was deterred by my dog's growling and barking. If I woke up to some man tickling my feet, I don't think I'd ever be able to sleep again. Ugh. I hope they were able to find and catch this man who did this because that would make me uneasy if I lived there. Number 3. Obsessed with my mom. This user said, my parents have a neighbor that is obsessed with my mom. It was innocent enough at first, he was just nice and they'd have small conversations. They became friendly and we would invite him over for barbecues and everything. Then he started to get creepy. Every single time my mom would take the dog out, he would appear outside and want to talk to her. He would find an excuse to come knock on our door every single day. He got the same haircut and grew the same goatee as my dad and started to dress like my dad. He then went and bought the exact same type of motorcycle as my dad. He then started showing up at my mom's work, bringing her lunch and flowers. That's when my dad had to confront him and it almost became physical, and he has mostly stayed away since. Excuse me? So weird. Number 2. Hates the dog. This story goes, we had a large fenced-in backyard. My dog wasn't terribly loud and she wasn't aggressive at all. She was just the size of a lab, and my neighbors, specifically the wife, thought that made her evil. They called the cops more than once, saying my dog was terrorizing the neighborhood. The cops came, met the dog, and we explained that she was always in her yard. They left saying just make sure she stays in the yard, and the neighbor called 2 more times to complain, and eventually they went and spoke to her about ludicrous complaints. Here is when she started taking matters into her own hands. We noticed our dog was getting sick a lot, like really sick. We took her to the vet and the vet said we needed to stop feeding her human food that could be bad for dogs. We had no clue what she was talking about. We went back home and decided to keep a closer eye on her. Turns out our neighbor had been dumping all manners of vile things over our fence. Food scraps, mop water, and God knows what else. We went and finally spoke to her about this and she denied it. Finally, we caught her on video and made sure she saw us recording her. Later that night, the husband comes over and apologizes for his wife and begs us not to call the cops. He promises he'll ensure our dog is left alone. We agreed but said if anything happened to our dog again, we would press charges. Thankfully, she stopped coming after our dog and eventually she fell very ill and passed. Her husband was like a different person. He invited us over for barbecues and all, and eventually even got himself a little dog. Now that is just evil. Messing with a poor dog, like, that's just wrong. And coming in at number 1 is crime scene. This online user said, "My dad lives in an apartment and one day he came home to cops outside of his door. They asked him some questions about his neighbor across the hall. Just general stuff like have you noticed anything weird, etc. My dad told him no, he looks like a well put together 30-ish-year-old businessman. The cops go on to explain that a 30-year-old woman is missing and was last seen by a security camera walking into the building with this man. But they never had any footage of her, or him for that matter, leaving the apartment. The cops stayed outside and monitored the apartment until about 5 p.m. that night when they finally got a warrant. They noticed a shower curtain missing and golf clubs scattered on the bedroom floor. They end up arresting the guy, and fast forward 3 weeks and the cops find her body about 45 minutes south in the woods on the side of a bike trail. Then about 2 months ago they found more tapes as the investigators went back to look at them. They discovered the man leaving the apartment with his golf bag. But like I said earlier, all of his clubs were in his room. I'm sure many people have put 2 and 2 together. A full-size woman wouldn't fit in a golf bag, but that's how he got her out. Oh, I mean, hey, at least nothing bad happened to their dad, but that is just scary.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Let's Celebrate. Okay. So this story is one wild ride, and it is honestly actually pretty terrifying. One night, a young woman was coming home late after she had been out having a few alcoholic beverages. Her creepy neighbor unfortunately witnessed this and for some reason decided to head to her front door with her. Her birthday had recently passed, and so when her weird neighbor tried to give her a hug, she just assumed it was him trying to be nice, but things quickly got even more strange. As she was trying to get into her own home, he kept insisting he should come in and have a drink with her so that they could celebrate more appropriately. Absolutely not. This woman was thinking quick because she decided to tell him that she couldn't find her keys, and then she quickly pulled out her phone and she said she was calling someone who might have them. She was actually calling her cousin though, and she told him how scared she was. He lived close by, so he jumped out of bed and drove really quickly to come and pick her up. I wish this was the end of the story, but she explains that shortly after this creepy night, her neighbor actually ended up poisoning one of her dogs just out of pure pettiness. That is so insane. In our number 9 spot today, we have the upstairs neighbor. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far, because it really helps us out. This story comes from someone who explains that they live in an apartment building. Their neighbors directly above them are the ones having some extremely fishy behavior. Apparently, it is not abnormal to hear this couple screaming and arguing with each other, which is quite a thing to have to get used to. But here's where things turn sinister. Our storyteller explains that she hasn't seen the wife for at least 3 months now, which obviously isn't normal. And now, suddenly, the husband says that he's going to Malaysia for a while, but our storyteller feels like he's going forever, considering he is also selling his apartment. And we still don't know where the wife is. I'm hoping that maybe they just decided to separate since they were obviously arguing all the time, and that nothing more sinister is going on here. If I was their neighbor, I'm sure my mind would definitely be racing as well, though. In our number 8 spot today, we have this suspicious behavior. This story starts off with a description of the family next door. There are 3 of them, a husband, a wife, and their 2-year-old daughter. Apparently, the husband has always been super weird and gave off some bad feelings. He had a really expensive car, and apparently basically all he did was drive it and wash it. So, one day, the police came knocking on our storyteller's door, and the police explained that apparently the husband and wife next door had supposedly gotten a divorce, but they wanted to know if they happened to know the whereabouts of the wife and daughter because they could not locate them. Our storyteller didn't know anything about their whereabouts, but gave what info she did know, which was that she had a 2-year-old and that she was maybe pregnant and that she drove a white Jeep. After this police visit, they didn't hear anything else, but of course kept their eyes and ears peeled. A few months after the police visit, the creepy husband is outside cleaning his expensive car, and this is when our storyteller sees the wife's white Jeep in the garage of the house. If she had run off, why would she leave her car? The creepy husband saw our storyteller see the Jeep, and just a few short days later, he ended up selling it. This could all just be a coincidence, but it certainly is all a little suspicious. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Skull Stealer. This next story is one that our storyteller luckily didn't have to witness, but it definitely is still quite strange. Apparently, this neighbor man was out and about searching for gold one day, and on his way back, he ended up being pulled over for some reason. The police ended up searching this man's car when they found something I don't think anyone was expecting. They found a real human skull. Sinister or not, why would you ever have something like that in the back of your car? This guy's excuse is that he found it while he was out searching and thought it belonged to an indigenous American. This man was most definitely arrested, and unfortunately, our storyteller doesn't know how the rest of this story panned out, but if it wasn't already clear, if you ever find a human skull, please don't take it home with you. In our number 6 spot today, we have Always Watching. This story is about the family that lived across the street from our storyteller when they were in high school. Our storyteller would walk to and from school every day, and while the mornings were normal, when he was coming home every day is when things got very weird. This family across the street would sit and stare out the window at this guy every single day as he returned from school. I couldn't imagine this happening to me once, let alone every single day, but that truly sounds like an absolute nightmare. To make things just a little more strange, it apparently wasn't uncommon for them to get phone calls from their scary neighbors' phone numbers, but when they answered, there just wasn't anyone on the other end. I feel like I would have immediately put my house up for sale or something, because every night I would feel like I would need to sleep with one eye open. In our number 5 spot today, we have Stay Away. This story comes from someone who had some weird neighbors when they were around 9 or 10 years old. The people who actually lived next door were a middle-aged couple, and while they didn't have any kids of their own, they had 3 nieces who were around the same age as him, so they would play together often. One day, the couple invited our storyteller to church with them. There isn't necessarily anything inherently wrong with that, but what happens next is where things turned a little strange. This couple then proceeded to explain why this child should come to church with them, which already sounds creepy. They began to explain that the world was about to end and that they were preparing for that. These fully grown adults literally told the child that if he wanted to live, he should go to church with them. I have a strong feeling that if he wanted to live, the best thing to do would be to absolutely not go to church with them under any circumstances. Who knows what church they were going to, but there's no way it was good. In our number 4 spot today, we have This Dangerous Fence. This story comes from someone from a family with 4 siblings for a total of 5 kids. They were all pretty rambunctious and unfortunately had the pleasure of living next to a family with 2 children, both of which were, of course, very well behaved. Obviously, the neighbor dad didn't take too kindly to living next door to a bunch of wild children, considering he had 2 perfect little angels. But he certainly took things way too far. One day our storyteller was climbing around on the fence that separated the 2 properties, and this set off the neighbor dad. Instead of doing literally anything normal, he decided to do one of the most messed up things he could. He took those nails that are used for carpets to grip the flooring and stuck them in bars of wood, which he then placed on top of the fence. Keep in mind that our storyteller is around 5 years old at this time. So every time he would try to climb to the top, he would be stuck by a nail, which would then cause him to fall off. Luckily, our storyteller never got seriously injured or anything from this, but how weird is it for the neighbor dad to react like that? In our number 3 spot today, we have The Rose Garden. This story comes from someone's aunt and is about a neighbor she had in the 70s and 80s. This neighbor was harmless but had quite a creepy pastime. This neighbor volunteered at a blood bank, which is obviously great, but since the 70s and 80s were pretty much just a free-for-all, there was an insane blood bank rule that allowed this neighbor lady to be able to take home the bags of blood that were expired and would be thrown out. I truly cannot believe that was a thing, but I guess this lady was resourceful. She would take these bags of blood and then use them as fertilizer for her garden. Our storyteller's aunt explains that you would see her out there on her knees, digging around with a big floppy sun hat, just working human blood into the soil around her roses. They end off this story by explaining that all of the flowers in her garden were truly magnificent, and I guess maybe she really was onto something. In our number 2 spot today, we have the next door dentist. This story comes from someone whose neighbor was a dentist, and he lived with his wife, and they apparently had one creepy child. Our storyteller explains that this weird family next door once absolutely freaked out on them for planting some flowers alongside their fence. They didn't go into detail about why, but the dentist family screamed as they said they didn't want anyone digging up their land. That's a reasonable request for sure, but also very, very suspicious. The dentist family ended up moving out 2 years after this strange incident, and our storyteller didn't really think much of them until 3 years after that. In an absolutely wild but not surprising turn of events, the dentist's dad ended up being arrested for kidnapping his patients. Our storyteller still has never had confirmation, but truly believes that there are still bodies located down there. In our number 1 spot today, we have Peeping Tom. Okay, so this one is truly one of the creepiest things I have ever heard. This story comes from a man who lives with his wife, and they have a downstairs neighbor who is certainly something else. First, this creepy neighbor approaches the wife and says to her that he can hear her and her husband all the time, with a super creepy and sinister grin on his face, which is absolutely horrifying to even think of. This is already creepy, but this story unfortunately gets worse. One day the wife was painting the porch of the house and accidentally dropped a paintbrush. She bent down to pick it up and sadly had to see what no one should have to see. Through the slits in the deck, she saw this creepy neighbor's eyes staring up at her. Tell me why this creepy man was laying under the porch, staring up at her, being a weirdo peeping Tom. They have no idea how long he was there for, and honestly, they probably don't even want to know. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. If you have any crazy neighbor stories, please let me know. Guys, these things are crazy. I thought I had bad neighbors, but truly nothing compares to the ones on these lists.
So starting us off, number 10, we actually have that guy from the intro of this video. That was crazy neighbor Mickey Jackson, who totally lost his mind. It all started when the neighbor was using a loud power washer to try to get paint off of his own property. The neighbors heard a loud noise and came outside and started yelling like right away. After just about minutes of the neighbors yelling, they got into their car. It looks like that they were gonna run down the neighbor making the loud noise.
Are you recording?
I mean, what is their problem? This is what you call a neighbor from hell. Now at number 9, we have the neighbor from apartment 213. The person that was living there had a lot of complaints of like strange smells and weird noises. No one ever reported it, they kind of just ignored it. The apartment was a 1-bedroom apartment located in Milwaukee, Oxford, and the person that was renting seemed like a neighbor from hell. Well, this went on for 2 years. Imagine having to put up with all those noises and weird smells for that long. Well, guess who rented room 213? It was Jeffrey Dahmer. Yes, one of the most famous serial killers in history. He would lure people into his apartment where he would kill them. That's where the smell was and that's what the sound was. He was finally caught and police found 7 human skulls in his apartment along with human hearts, muscles, and 74 Polaroid pictures of his various victims. I mean, is this real life right now? 74 victims? Next up, number 8, we have a most wanted man as a neighbor. I mean, no thanks. Call the FBI. Well, Mr. Thundercat shared his story online. He talked about how his neighbor were wanted felons. He didn't realize how dangerous his neighbors were, well, until he found a picture of them on the 50 most wanted man. So they called the police, but they didn't believe him and they called him a child. Apparently he was 22 years old at the time. Well, after 4 months that went by, more and more people called to complain, and when they showed up, they realized, wow, actually, yeah, this is the guy we've been looking for a very long time. Why didn't nobody tell us? I mean, people were trying to tell you. and I wonder what landed them to be on the top 50 most wanted men list. I mean, do you have to kill someone to land yourself on that list? Well, you know what? Maybe I don't want to know the answer to this, so let's move on. Moving into number 6, I actually have a pretty scary neighbor story. Okay, I might have a couple of them on this list. Well, the first one is here right now. Well, I had a neighbor when I was about 12 or 13 years old. One day I got home from school and there was so many police cars and a ton of officers with like these black masks on. There were also TV news crews. I honestly couldn't believe what was going on. I eventually found out that my neighbors had grow-ups in the house right next to us and we had no idea. I mean, they were pretty dangerous criminals. I don't even know how we never smelt it. I mean, there was thousands of bags full of weed. At number 5, I actually have another neighbor story for you guys. I mean, what? I grew up in Foster. I traveled from home to home and I've had a lot of neighbors. Saying that though, this story actually happened when I was 18 years old, when I was living with my dad. So one day we noticed smoke coming through like our front door of our apartment. We realized that there was a fire in the apartment right next to us. So we started getting towels and soaking them and putting them next to doorways. We made sure to have buckets of water in case the fire got in. And then we had to go to our bathroom and our bedrooms and just open up the windows, and we were hanging our face outside of the window because the apartment was filling up with smoke. So we found out just a few doors down there was another grow up. I mean, what the heck is going on? Am I the one that's attracting all these types of people? So apparently they were using so much power, the electrical room caught on fire and exploded. Our neighbor right next to them had to jump out of their window. We were on the 4th floor. My sister was taken into the ambulance because she inhaled so much smoke. It was super scary, and then we had to live in a hotel for the next like 3 months. It was a pretty insane time of my life. All right, number 4, we have a neighbor who might become a murderer. Well, Reddit user Catch Me a Bird had this to say. When I was 7, our next door neighbor came pounding on our front door to scream and threaten to kill my dad because our pet that we kept in our backyard was being too loud. The pet was a rabbit. A rabbit. Is this real life right now? Okay. I own 2 rabbits and they're just not loud creatures at all. My rabbits are free roaming, they live in our living room, and when people come over, they have no idea that rabbits are even there because they're super quiet and like to hang out underneath our coffee table. I mean, this neighbor is insane. He could face jail time because he is threatening someone else's life over a rabbit. Hopefully these were empty threats because I would be pretty worried. At number 3, we have a crazy woman who likes to set random fires and loves to scream in her backyard. I mean, this would be absolutely annoying. The person who shared this story on Reddit calls this woman the crazy cat lady who lives in her trailer in the front yard. I mean, this is the most random thing ever. She has a house. Why is she in the trailer? Apparently there was a toilet in the front yard as well. And I guess to stay warm, this woman lights bonfires in her front yard. The Reddit user also said that they were very afraid of this woman. I guess because you never know what she will do next. So they always check their closets to make sure that the woman wasn't inside of it. Now that would be a very scary situation, and even scarier if it was cold at night and one night she decides to light up your house as a bonfire for warmth. Number 2, we have the woman who would pour human blood in her rose garden. Is this real life right now? Okay, maybe this should be at number 1. I mean, what beats this one? Well, the story comes from Harry Bridges. Back in the 70s and 80s, my aunt had a neighbor who was a longtime volunteer at the local blood bank. I doubt this would be allowed today, but back then, she was allowed to take home the old expired blood, which would otherwise be thrown out. She used it as fertilizer for her garden. You'd see her out on sunny days on her knees with a big sun hat and gloves, cheerfully pouring human blood into the soil around her roses. Okay, wait, really? Were you actually allowed to take home expired blood? I wonder if people try to sell this expired blood. If I saw my neighbor pouring blood on their front yard, I'm calling the police because I'm pretty sure I have Dexter Morgan living right next door. Finally, number 1, now this one is very scary. This one comes from user Chopped to Pieces. I mean, that's a scary username. Well, they said, there was this guy who lived with his wife and his dog a few doors away in a big house. He rarely left his house, and when he did, he only took his dog for a walk. He also talked very rarely and seemed to avoid other people, while his wife was somewhat more social. The couple lived on our street for a few years, and everything appeared to be fine. However, someday they divorced, and the lady moved away for reasons unknown. So here's the scary part. When the person returned from school, they noticed a SWAT team in front front of their house, and the neighbor's house. Apparently, this man tried to commit suicide and he planned to take out the whole street with him. He flooded his entire basement with gasoline and he had an improvised bomb in his garden shed. It was essentially a big pile of propane gas tanks tied together. Well, luckily this plan didn't work out and he was stopped before a massive bomb boomed before it went off. It's so scary because this person's house would have been gone by the time he got home from school.
Number 10, I think my roommate wants to kill me. A big mistake you can make when it comes to a roommate is moving in with your friend. You think it'll be fun and then you find out the real them and that they wipe back to front. Or something much worse happened to her to Redditor shyfawns_1. She moved in with her best friend and then started noticing she would snap back and forth between this charming cute girl with big doe eyes to staring daggers at her and snapping at her for the smallest thing. I think I dated this girl. She also said this girl would have vivid nightmares with blood and knives and unknown bodies, blood coming down from the walls, blood in the sinks, knives under her pillows, bodies in the yard. She also had a deadly stare and this dead look in her eyes. Oh, I definitely dated this girl. This story doesn't have a follow-up, so we don't know what happened with this roommate situation or this horrific friendship. Number 9, Carl. First rule of roommates is you should probably get to know them before you give them the keys to your place and you leave to go on vacation for 2 months. You don't want to end up like Redditor VYF8AC. She was living with her boyfriend at the time and they needed a third to help cut cost. So they put a call out and met Carl. Carl seemed like an ordinary guy, he had a job, he didn't smell bad. He checked all the good boxes for a new roommate. This was until her and her boyfriend went on vacation. While on vacation, they got a call from Carl that he had lost his job and needed to move out. Not a big deal, they told him the damage deposit would cover next month's rent and that he could move out shortly after that. But weird stuff started when they got back from their trip and saw a bunch of suitcases and a woman named Nancy. They asked who she was and she said, "What are you doing in Carl's apartment?" Apparently where they're gone, Carl had put the couple's room up for listing and Nancy was just moving in. Carl was at work while this was happening, so the three got to hash it out, and Nancy had mentioned that Carl had been putting peanuts in the milk. And this Redditor's boyfriend is deathly allergic to peanuts. He would have died if he drank the milk, which Carl apparently knew. It wasn't long after that Carl came home, was confronted by the three and kicked out. And get this, on the way out, he was trying to get the boyfriend to drink the milk. What was his plan? Murder 2 people and then sit on a lease? I mean, for cheap rent in Toronto, I kind of understand. Number 8, baby bird. One of the hardest things about roommates is you have to share a fridge. People you don't know. People who don't know how to throw out their old food and ends up stinking up the whole fridge. Sometimes they'll take your food without asking. Sometimes they'll take your juice and leave just a little bit at the bottom, acting like they left you some, Michael. Sorry, but nothing really stacks up to this when it comes to creepy subreddit things. This post was found on the Creep subreddit. Someone posted about a baby bird they found in a Ziploc bag on a freezer, even had a date on it. You might be thinking, oh, maybe this was an experiment, but the comments clear that up pretty quickly, and she says her roommate isn't a scientist, but she's in theater. She was too scared to ask her roommate why she had a dead bird in the freezer, and why would anyone think it's okay to keep a dead bird in the same place I keep my frozen Michelinas, Michael? Number 7, creepy Craigslist roommate. Imagine you're young, moving to a new city for college, you're on Craigslist to find a roommate. Well, that's when bad things can happen, when you go on Craigslist to find someone to share your most intimate space with. Well, Redditor Mac1187 found Beth. At first she seemed normal. The first night he moved in, they went up for pizza, and she kept saying he looked like Shia LaBeouf, which didn't seem weird until they got back to the apartment and she invited him to see her room, which was plastered with posters of Shia LaBeouf. After this, he almost never saw her. He would only hear her giggling from her room, and occasionally she would stand in the hallway and just stare at him. One night, Beth was drunk and stumbled into the living room. She started telling our friend from Reddit the story of her ex-boyfriend, which got her very worked up, and she ended up yelling that she would slit his throat. This obviously freaked him out, so that night when he went to bed, he barricaded his door with a dresser. Later that night, he woke up to the sound of the dresser scraping the floor and Beth trying to break in. He stopped her. She went back to her room, but in the morning, when he walked out of his room, he saw a giant steak knife right outside the door. So he immediately found a new place to live, moved out of there, and the day he moved out, he received 40 text messages from the girl that ranged from "How are you?" to
I'm gonna kill myself! Wow. I'm going to kill myself and it's your fault!
Number 6, The Little Mermaid. Now it can be hard to share your space with, say, a human, but how about someone who believes they're a witch/mermaid? Now no one would ever pick this. In fact, if you're ever moving in with someone, one of the first things you should ask is, what's the worst thing about you? If their answer is, I keep a 6-foot mermaid tail in the common spaces and practice witchcraft, just hold out for a nicer place. But this story happens in college, and you get assigned your roommates in college. This poor girl got paired with someone who believes she's a mythical creature. She got permission from the school to swim with her tail in the school pool, so there was always a 6-foot mermaid tail hanging out like the third roommate. Terrible. You just get to college, you're trying to make new friends, and everyone knows you as the girl who smells like fish. Number 5, surprise boyfriend. Redditor Hassan Ice Crunch had a terrifying, unexpected visitor. She came home one day to find her ex-boyfriend/ex-roommate in her apartment. He still had a key. He then attacked her, grabbed her, and locked her in a room with him. The worst part about this is her other roommate saw this happening and just got scared and hid in his room. He didn't call the police, he didn't try to help. Not cool, bro. She was able to escape later once her ex fell asleep, and then quickly went to the police and also got the locks changed. Also gave her roommate the worst friend of all time award. Number 4, disturbing note. A very common thing with roommates is every now and again you get one that likes to leave you post-it notes about little things they don't like don't leave your laundry here, empty the dishwasher, stop watching me sleep. Well, this one is creepier than all of those. On the creepy subreddit, we found someone who posted a pic of a note left by a roommate, and the note said, "The devil loves you." Not 1, not 2, but 20 times. That would freak me out. I'm just trying to figure out what devil love looks like without simultaneously ending up a lampshade. Number 3, secret roommate. You move into a new place and you keep hearing footsteps. Sometimes when you come home, the cupboards are open and you can't remember if it was you or if you have a ghost. How about neither? A couple of guys going to Ohio State University had this happen. They had just found a great place to live, so close to campus, but they would often hear strange noises. There was a door that was locked that looked like it led to a basement, but they thought it was just a utility closet. One day they heard all sorts of beeping noises coming through the door, and they decided to investigate. They broke the door down to find a fully furnished room. It had framed pictures, textbooks. Someone had been secretly living in their apartment this entire time. The mystery squatter wasn't there at the time, so they quickly got people to remove all of his things. Number 2, roommate cleaning your food. This story was covered by ABC News, and it's about Haley King. Haley and her roommates were fighting, so her roommates asked her to move out, which she refused. So her roommates set up a sting with a hidden camera they put in the kitchen and saw her spitting in their food and pouring Windex in it. If my roommate set up a camera in the kitchen, all they would see is me pretending to be a celebrity chef and having one of those fake arguments about something that happened 6 years ago. Haley admitted to the crimes and may face up to 20 years in jail. And our number 1 on the list, roommate wanted, female only. So, a very important part about going apartment shopping is go with someone. You have no idea who your potential roommate is. Amanda didn't do this, and what happened to her was insane. She saw an ad on Craigslist that read, "Roommate wanted, female only." Now, do you really need more red flags than a Craigslist ad looking for women? The ad should just say, "I want to smell your hair and wear it." Well, Amanda went to go see the apartment, thinking the owner was female. But when she got there was a guy in his mid-40s. He had a gut, he was unshaven, he was more disheveled than Homer Simpson. He started showing her around the place. It was disgusting. There was no furniture, some of the rooms were boarded up. Not suspicious at all. After the tour, he says, "Oh, I haven't shown you the basement yet." At this point, if you get murdered, it's kind of just Darwinism. Luckily, Amanda gets a text message, which she pretends is a phone call, and she rushes out of there. When she gets home, she calls the police, who investigate the house. The boarded up room was apparently his room, and all that was in there was some moldy clothes, and it was covered in clippings of porno mags, like the world's saddest dungeon. Then, the police found a piece of fishing twine over one of the steps going down to the basement. It was booby-trapped. There was also a bunch of belts that were probably used to tie someone up. Thank God Amanda got that phone call.
Starting off our list in our number 10 spot, we have impeccable timing. Okay,
This story is one that has quite the plot twist that I absolutely was not expecting. It reads, quote, "There is this one guy in my neighborhood. We seem to operate on the same schedule since we see each other at the bus stop almost every day. We never talk much, he always just asks me for a cigarette and I usually give him one. The problem is that I don't have a sensible schedule. My classes are at a different time every day and get rescheduled more often than not, and I make my own work hours, so I just come in whenever. Last time I saw him was a couple of hours ago. I'm walking home, middle of the night, and some guy jumps me from the back saying, 'Do you have a cigarette?' I turn around and it's the same guy just strolling around the neighborhood at 2:30 a.m. looking for somebody to lend him a smoke. My instincts are telling me that something is seriously wrong here, but what do you guys think? I don't feel like this is just a strange coincidence." In our number 9 spot today we have The Agent. This neighbor story comes from someone who lived in an apartment building and who had one neighbor who was exceptionally nosy and suspicious of others in the building. So much so that she decided to do something absolutely insane, which was to stage phone calls with FBI headquarters about other tenants in the building and what she called alarming behavior. This behavior she's referencing would have to be something super outlandish and crazy for her to go to those lengths, right? Oh no, we're talking like people coming home after 9 p.m. and she's like, better call the FBI. The story then continues on to say that she even went as far as to post a fake government notice on the walls of the building. This lady just will not quit. So, guess what made this lady stop all of her nonsense? Well, the storyteller decided to take a page out of her book and they staged a fake phone call. This time, they just loudly chatted about the illegalities of everything that this lady was doing, including her impersonation of an FBI agent. Who would have guessed? Shortly after this staged call, the neighbor lady stopped. In our number 8 spot today, we have Peeping Tom. Okay, so this one is truly one of the creepiest things I have ever heard. This story comes from a man who lives with his wife, and they have a downstairs neighbor who is certainly something else. First, this neighbor approaches the wife and says to her that he can hear her and her husband all the time, with a super creepy and sinister grin on his face, which is already absolutely horrifying to even think of. This is already enough to just give you the heebie-jeebies, but this story unfortunately gets worse. One day the wife was painting the porch of the house and accidentally dropped a paintbrush. She bent down to pick it up, and this is when she had to see what no one should have to see. Through the slits in the deck, she saw this creepy neighbor's eyes staring up at her. Tell me why this guy was just laying under the porch staring up at her being a weirdo peeping Tom while she painted the porch. They have no idea how long he was there for, and honestly, they probably don't even want to know. In our number 7 spot today, we have The Next Door Dentist. This story comes from someone whose neighbor was a dentist and he lived with his wife, and they apparently had one kinda creepy child. Our storyteller explains that this weird family next door once absolutely freaked out at them for planting some flowers alongside their fence. They didn't go into detail about why, but the dentist's family screamed as they said they didn't want anyone digging up their land. That's a reasonable request for sure, but also a little suspicious. The dentist's family ended up moving out 2 years after this strange incident, and our storyteller didn't really think of them much until 3 years after that. In an absolutely wild but not surprising turn of events, the dentist dad ended up being arrested for kidnapping his patients. Our storyteller still has never had confirmation, but truly believes that there are still bodies located there on the property. In our number 6 spot today, we have Always Watching. This story is about the family that lived across the street from our storyteller when they were in high school. Our storyteller would walk to and from school every day, and while the mornings were normal, when he was coming home every day is when things got weird. This family across the street would sit and stare out the window at this guy every single day as he returned from school. I couldn't imagine this happening to me once, let alone every day. That truly sounds like an absolute nightmare. To make things just a little more strange, it apparently wasn't uncommon for them to get phone calls from their scary neighbor's phone number, but when they answered, there just wasn't anyone on the other line. I feel like I would have immediately put my house up for sale or something, because every night I would feel like I need to sleep with one eye open. In our number 5 spot today, we have The Cat Came Back. Okay, last time, on part 1, we had a weird neighbor cat story, and this time we have another one that is arguably weirder and creepier. I'm just saying, if you've got a cat and a strange neighbor, you might want to watch out, because these stories are putting me on edge. This one goes, quote, "There was an old man who lived next door to my last house. I'd wake up every morning to about an hour of, 'Here, kitty, kitty, kitty.' My cat once went missing for about a week, and he came back with a shaved stomach." Listen, Without the whole neighbor part, that story would still be weird and concerning. I'm glad the cat came back, but why in the world was his stomach shaved? Maybe it wasn't the neighbor, I mean there's no proof per se, but man, the whole thing is definitely weird. If it wasn't the neighbor, then what on earth was he up to calling for a cat every morning? I have a lot of questions about this one, and I don't think that any of them are getting answered anytime soon. In our number 4 spot today, we have the photographer. This strange neighbor story is a very short but exceptionally effective one. The storyteller wrote just, quote, "They sent me pictures of myself mowing the lawn. I had no idea." Imagine getting a photo of yourself that you had no idea someone else took, let alone your neighbor. I feel like I would always feel as if someone's eyes were on me after that. Just full of paranoia to the brim. In our number 3 spot today, we have the eavesdropper. This neighbor story is about someone who loves to eavesdrop and get involved in things that certainly aren't their business, and they managed to take it way too far. This person wrote, quote, "We had this neighbor that was always in our business. He would tap our phone lines and listen to our problems and then call my grandfather to tell him what was going on with my parents' marriage. We would also find footprints and fresh snowfall walking all around our property and onto our deck. Weird dude." Honestly, I feel like I would be making up some crazy outlandish stories just to test to see if this man really was listening in. I would say that I had like treasure buried in the backyard or something and see if he tried to dig it up. This story certainly is strange, but the storyteller seems fairly casual about the whole experience, so it seems as though it's a story that stuck with them but didn't bother them too much. In our number 2 spot today, we have the vet visit. Okay, I don't know what it is with people and pets, but neighbors seriously need to leave other people's alone. This story starts out with the storyteller taking their dog for a pretty regular or standard visit to the vet. While on this visit, however, things start to take a turn when the vet tells them to stop feeding the dog human food. This confused them because they were quite strict about only feeding their dog food. Well, after a little investigation, it turns out that the neighbor this storyteller had, this one who would often call the police about this dog's behavior even though it was a nice, sweet Labrador that showed no aggression at all, yeah, apparently this neighbor had been leaning over the fence to feed the dog food scraps, mop water, and some other harmful things. This one might actually be worse than the neighbors who were stealing the cats. This is truly next level, and I'm glad that the vet was able to catch this and the storyteller could get to the bottom of it all. In our number 1 spot today, we have the neighbor across the hall. Okay guys, this one is definitely the most serious on this list, and it truly is terrifying. Basically, this storyteller's dad lives in an apartment building, and one day he gets a knock on the door and it turns out to be the police. They come in and start asking this man about his neighbor across the hall. They ask him if he's seen anything weird or that sort of thing, but the dad tells them no. He looks well put together, like a businessman, he's around 30, just nothing out of the ordinary, you know, just a regular guy who just lives across the hall. The police then explain that a 30-year-old woman is missing and that she was last seen on security camera footage walking into the building with that guy, but the security camera never captured either of them leaving. In the end, the police get a warrant and they notice a missing shower curtain and that there's golf clubs everywhere, and at this point they place the neighbor under arrest. Sadly, about 3 weeks later, the police found the missing woman, but someone had taken her life. They then go on to write, quote, "Then about 2 months ago they found more tapes. As the investigators went back to look at them, they discovered the man leaving the apartment with his golf bag. But like I said earlier, all of the clubs were in his room. It definitely doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what is going on here at all. I guess this neighbor guy is now saying that it was an accident and he panicked and tried to hide it because he had a girlfriend." At the time the person posted this story, the guy's trial was coming up, and I'm sure it didn't exactly go well for him. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have the entrepreneur. Okay, this neighbor story starts out actually quite nice before it takes one of the wildest turns I've ever seen. So basically the storyteller starts out by explaining that their old neighbor was like the perfect neighbor. They were quiet, they were polite and cordial, and sometimes the two of them would even share a quick chat should they run into each other in the hall. Truly the dream neighbor. The story starts to take a different turn when the storyteller reveals that their nice neighbor is certainly in the business of selling illicit substances, we'll call them. But they also explain that all of his customers were also lovely and were sure to not make too much noise when they were coming by, even if it was late at night or early in the morning. Now, here's where the story takes quite the turn. Turns out that one night, some sort of altercation ensued, and this nice, quiet neighbor ended up taking the lives of 2 people who were at his door. Apparently, it all happened in the hallway, which was quite a gruesome scene afterwards. The storyteller has quite the twist again at the end when they write, quote, "It was crazy. Still, after he got sent to prison, a new guy moved in that played music constantly as loud as he possibly could. I'll take old Stevie back any day." Honestly, I don't agree, but I completely understand. In our number 9 spot today, we have the plot twist. As if that one wasn't enough. Okay, this story is a short one, but man is it effective. They start out by saying, quote, "I used to live in a house that was split into 2 apartments. My neighbor had the lower half, and I learned we had issues with the HVAC when their cigarette smoke came visibly pouring out our registers, stank up everything we owned." Okay, that definitely sucks. I'm sure it's a situation many people have dealt with before, and it would be really frustrating, and honestly, it's hazardous. Surprisingly though, this isn't the worst of it. There's one more sentence to the story, and it somehow still manages to take us on quite a journey. So after they wrote, quote, "stake up everything we owned," they finished with, quote, "then one of them stole my car." Okay, honestly, worse than the smoke, and also, I have a million questions about this. Starting with how, and ending with what happened after. I would love a follow-up on this one. In our number 8 spot today, we have a house's history. So there are places that have certain rules around what a selling agent would have to tell an interested buyer about the history of the house prior to purchasing. Some things are extremely important to some people and not at all to others. I mean, for example, some people don't really mind living in houses that were once the scene of a horrific crime. I personally feel like I wouldn't exactly be comfortable with that. Some things in some areas, however, don't have such widespread rules when it comes to these things, which means that sometimes new homeowners are in for quite a surprise, just like these ones. This story starts off, quote, "When we moved in, he," meaning the neighbor, "came over to tell us the house had previously burned down twice. News to us." Okay, that's interesting, but not too scary yet, but they continue on to say, quote, "Got the feeling he wanted to sort of brag about how he saved people from the fires. Then a few years later, after leaving our garage door open, we found our stored grill with all the unlit burners on and a bit of burnt paper sitting underneath. He's since disappeared, but we lock up our propane now." What in the world? How terrifying! The man disappeared? This is why I Google everything first. From places to people, I scour the internet prior because you never know, people are strange. In our number 7 spot today, we have the backdoor neighbor. This story starts off when a couple moved into a new house in the summer of 2019. Upon moving in, both of the neighbors on either side warned this couple about the neighbor who lived behind them, as they had been known to cause quite a bit of trouble. The first 6 months were fine, but things quickly took a turn. They go on to explain that, quote, "Their house sits on a hill behind ours, and so it overlooks the majority of our backyard due to the elevation change. Well, one night, morning technically, at about 3 a.m. we wake up to ring notifications from our phones showing video from our front doorbell. There's a man standing barefoot in a sleeveless shirt on our porch pounding on our front door. We give it 2 to 3 minutes just watching him on the app, thinking maybe he's drunk and has the wrong house, essentially giving him the benefit of the doubt. At this point, the guy at the door starts to yell, he's cursing, he's saying that he's gonna fight them, and then he leaves the front to head around the side of the house towards the backyard. They still have no idea who this is, so they of course call the police. Before the police arrive, the neighbor behind them turns on a huge spotlight that's shining into the storyteller's backyard, and they're thinking, okay, our neighbors, they know something's going on and they gave us some light to like check it all out or whatever. Turns out, not the case at all. Once the police arrive, it becomes clear that the spotlight neighbor is the one who was pounding on the door, and here's the reason. The neighbor said to the police when they showed up that he was angry because a few nights prior, in the middle of the night, the storyteller let his dog out in his own backyard, but that when he did it, he was in his boxers, and the neighbor was claiming that he did it on purpose to make him uncomfortable since their yard looks down on the storytellers and they could see everything. They then write, quote, "He then followed this up to the police with evidence, which consisted of videos he had taken through our windows of my wife and I inside our own home doing totally normal things like chores, watching TV, etc. Nothing inappropriate or scandalous, not that it would have mattered anyway, we were in our own home." This story truly is next level. In the end, the police clearly understood that there was a breach of privacy, and it is said that the weird neighbors moved out a few months after and the couple celebrated that like it was a holiday. And I do not blame them one little bit. In our number 6 spot today, we have Sebald. Okay, so what happened to friendly neighbors coming over to ask to borrow a cup of sugar? Was that ever how things were, or is that just what movies in Hollywood fed us? It's gotta be made up, right? Or else, how did we get from that to this? This story reads, quote, "A guy named Sebald. He straight up smelled like tuna all the time. He'd come knock on our door to ask for random things in his robe. A rubber band, an apple slicer, a doorstop, like probably once a week. My bedroom door faced his kitchen, and sometimes I'd look over and see him lying on the floor. It was bizarre. Sebald, what in the world is going on? Are you okay? Listen, this isn't the scariest or the worst neighbor. The man just needs some items and likes lying on the floor. I'm certainly not judging, I'm just wondering why. I would have a lot of questions for Sebald if he was my neighbor, but hey, at least he's not out here causing harm. That's definitely more than we can say for some other people on today's list." In our number 5 spot today, we have the early riser. Okay, if anyone has any idea as to what could be going on in this one, please let me know, because from where I'm standing, it just is all extremely weird. This weird neighbor story explains that this specific neighbor loved to get up early. Not like absurdly early, but a solid 6 a.m. wake up every day, which is for sure a commitment. That isn't weird, a lot of people do that, but what a lot of people don't do after their 6 a.m. wake up every day is proceed to go out into the backyard of their home and fight a random mannequin while shouting at the top of their lungs. I guess the whole neighborhood is waking up at 6 a.m. every morning now, too, because this guy's got some steam he needs to release. Honestly, this would be the most annoying thing, but I'd also be very curious and concerned as to what this was all about. In our number 4 spot today, we have Goat Guy. Okay, this is definitely not an inherently terrifying story, but it is so bizarre that it has me just a little on edge. So basically, this short little explanation is, quote, "Old guy that lived next door when I was young would shower in the backyard, would buy goats to do his lawn. Eventually he stopped buying goats and would just set the lawn on fire. I mean, buying goats to eat your grass so you don't have to cut it is a very expensive method, but a method nonetheless. But setting it on fire? What an absolute hazard to yourself and everyone around you. There's just so much bizarrety going on in this one, I don't even know what to think." In our number 3 spot today, we have Linda Listen. This neighbor story starts off with a storyteller explaining that they have quite a few interesting neighbor stories from this one in particular, named Linda. They go on to write, quote, "Linda would often have men outside the apartment building that she locked out screaming her name. But the best story regards a boyfriend Linda had who insisted my roommate and I call him the Captain. About a week after meeting him, we came home to a wedding announcement for Linda and the Captain. Yes, his name was the Captain on the announcement. Exactly 1 week later still, the Captain was arrested outside of our apartment building for public intoxication at 2 a.m. while screaming, 'I've made a huge mistake. F you, Linda, a huge mistake. I'm ruined.' It seems as though this guy was no longer the Captain. I have no idea what happened here or what led to this demise, but I mean, I can't exactly say I'm surprised." In our number 2 spot today, we have Cat Lady. This story is from someone named Kate, and she starts off explaining that she had a cat named Donovan, and her strange neighbor was named Susan. Susan was single, in her 50s, seemed nice, and had a lovely garden. Kate then goes on to write, quote, "One summer we were going on vacation for a week. We asked if she could look after the cat while we were gone. She enthusiastically said yes and offered to have our cat stay at her house so it wouldn't get bored or lonely. How sweet of her." Kate then explains that they go away on vacation, everything's great, but when they came back and Kate's mom went to pick up the cat, things went awry. She explains that Susan was weirdly attached to this cat after 1 week, so much so that she was full on weeping when she was giving the cat back. Kate's mom was weirded out but thanked her, paid her, and then left. Kate then goes on to write that a few days later she woke up early and came to find out that Susan had walked the entire acre that separated their houses in order to try and look for Donovan. She was saying that she just needed to see her baby. Kate says that it was weird, but they let it go this time. But then she writes, quote, "Then one day we had let our cat out for a while, it was an indoor-outdoor cat, and when we called him to come in, he didn't come. We checked all the places he usually lounged and he was nowhere to be found. We searched for hours. Finally, after a day of searching, my dad said, 'Oh my god, Susan.' could she? My parents quickly went over there to ask if she had seen the cat, and Susan vehemently denied knowing anything about where the cat was. She was visibly angry about being asked, and then offered up, "What do you think, that I stole him?" Then my mom started calling his name and whistling for him, and before Susan could get the door slammed, he strolled to the door from somewhere inside the house and greeted my mom with a meow. My mom was pissed. She started yelling about, "If you ever steal our cat again, and I ought to call the police," and left. He was an indoor cat for the next few months until we moved again. Honestly, could you imagine your neighbor stealing your animal? I would have absolutely lost my mind. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Flyers. So this story starts out with a storyteller explaining to us that he lives in a fourplex that is mostly elderly people living in it, and that there was another fourplex across from them, and that was basically the situation for the entire block. So one night, when our storyteller is going out with some friends, as they're leaving his place, a neighbor of his comes out, and a very hateful altercation ensues. The neighbor man yells some horrible things, the storyteller yells some things back, and that's when the neighbor makes some very serious threats, and then the storyteller just carries on with heading out for the night. Then he goes on to write, quote, "Well, when I got home, he had super glued my screen door completely shut, poured hamburger helper or something similar into my AC unit, scratched up my very expensive and still quite new Lexus SUV." This isn't where it ends though. They then take photos from the storyteller's Facebook and use them to spread a horrible, dangerous rumor about the storyteller. The insane neighbor used these photos to make posters and flyers spreading this rumor, and then on the back of them, quote, "He stated where I worked, what time I left, what time I arrived, when I took lunch, and where I went on the weekends. It was very unusual. I ended up having to take him to court, file a restraining order against him after he showed up to my job, threatened to burn down my building, which I finally had enough and went outside to fight him. Luckily, my employees already had him cornered out in the parking lot. Thank God for restraining orders." You guys, this one is probably the most insane we have on this list. That's just next level and also very dangerous. I'm just glad the storyteller made it through this entire ordeal, and I hope that they were awarded with great neighbors from then on.